Back in 1815, a single event on a tiny remote island did something incredible. It plunged the entire world into darkness, and in that darkness, it unleashed famine, chaos, and somehow two of the most famous monsters we've ever imagined. I want you to just imagine this for a second. It's June, but instead of sunshine, you get snow. It's July, but a hard frost is wiping out all the crops. Now, this isn't some sci-fi movie plot. For millions of people, this was a terrifying, unbelievable reality. They actually called it 1800 and froze to death. I'm not kidding. Across the entire northern hemisphere, the weather just went completely off the rails. It was this global mystery, a cold, relentless, sunless year that pushed entire societies right to the brink. So what on earth was going on? Well, the answer wasn't in the skies over Europe or North America. No, it was halfway across the world, born from fire and rock. You see, the chaos of 1816 was really an echo, a devastating aftershock from a geological event of almost unimaginable power. But here's the thing. This wasn't just one bad day. The planet's atmosphere was already, you could say, primed for disaster. If you look at this timeline, you'll see that for years leading up to 1816, a whole series of major volcanic eruptions had been pumping ash and gas into the air. Each one was like adding more fuel to a fire, just building and building towards a huge climax. And then it happened. The final cataclysmic blow. On the Indonesian island of Sumbawa, Mount Tambora didn't just erupt, it literally detonated. The explosion was so massive, it was heard over 1,600 miles away. This was the one. This was the event that tipped the entire planet's climate right over the edge. The volcano blasted 100 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and sulfur dioxide straight up into the stratosphere. Now, that material didn't just fall back down. Oh no, it formed a gigantic veil, a kind of planetary sunshade that started to drift around the globe, reflecting sunlight back into space. To give you a little perspective here, just look at this chart. We've all heard of Mount St. Helens, right? That was a VEI 5. The infamous Krakatoa in 1883 was a VEI 6, Tambora a VEI 7. And since that scale is logarithmic, it means Tambora was 10 times more powerful than Krakatoa. It was in a completely different league. For the people living on the island of Sumbawa, the immediate impact was just apocalyptic. An estimated 71,000 people died, first from the blast itself, and then from the starvation and disease that swept through the survivors. This eyewitness account from a British officer paints a truly horrifying picture of what it was like at ground zero. So as this giant volcanic cloud began to spread across the globe, the chaos spread with it. The global cooling it triggered set off a worldwide crisis, a terrible domino effect of crop failures, starvation, and social breakdown. And let me be clear, the year without a summer wasn't a localized problem. It was everywhere. In Europe, it led to massive famine and food riots. In North America, crops just failed completely. In China, bizarre summer frosts and floods destroyed the rice harvest. And in India, the disruption of the monsoons led to a new deadly strain of cholera that would eventually become a global pandemic. Europe, which was already exhausted from the Napoleonic Wars, was hit especially hard. People were starving. Desperate mobs were rioting in the streets for bread. The crisis in Ireland was so bad that it sparked one of the first great waves of emigration to the United States, as people fled just to survive. But here's where things get really weird. In a bizarre climactic twist, while the rest of Europe was freezing, Russia had surprisingly good weather and great harvests. It actually became the breadbasket for the entire continent, with its farmers profiting from the same disaster that was causing so much suffering just a few hundred miles away. It's just a perfect illustration of how unpredictable these global shocks can be. Okay, so we've talked about all the doom and gloom, but this story isn't just about destruction. In the middle of all this darkness and cold and rain, something else was happening. The disaster, in its own strange way, became this powerful catalyst for human creativity and, well, invention. And this brings us to the most famous part of our story. Picture this, Switzerland, summer of 1816. A group of friends are on vacation, but they're trapped indoors by the miserable volcanic weather. That group included Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, a young Mary Godwin, who would soon become Mary Shelley, and Byron's doctor John Polidori. Bored out of their minds by the endless rain, they started reading German ghost stories. And Byron came up with a challenge. Who could write the best horror story? The results of that little contest, absolutely astonishing. From that one single rain-soaked challenge, fueled by the volcanic gloom, two of literature's greatest icons were born. Mary Shelley dreamed up Frankenstein, basically inventing the entire genre of science fiction, and John Polidori wrote The Vampire, which gave us the blueprint for that suave, aristocratic vampire that still completely dominates pop culture today, all because a mountain exploded on the other side of the planet. And the creativity wasn't just literary. The crisis sparked some seriously practical inventions, too. For instance, the massive failure of the oat crop meant that feeding horses became incredibly expensive. So, a German inventor named Karl von Dres created a horseless alternative, a running machine, which was the direct ancestor of the bicycle. And a chemist named Justus von Liebig, who had lived through the famine as a kid, was so affected by it that he dedicated his life to preventing another one, eventually inventing the first artificial fertilizers. So what does all of this really mean? It points to a much bigger, more profound idea. What if disasters aren't just endings? What if they're also accelerators, events that force us to think and innovate in ways we never would have otherwise? Researchers actually have a name for events like the Tambora eruption. They call it a wild card. It's a random external shock to the system with totally unpredictable consequences, but it can act as a trigger, a catalyst that dramatically speeds up history. The response to Tambora also highlights a huge shift in human thinking. For centuries, the default way to look at a disaster like this was to see it as divine punishment, God's anger that you just had to endure. But a new idea was emerging in the 19th century, the idea that a disaster is actually an engineering problem. It's a challenge to be understood and solved with science and innovation, whether that solution is a bicycle or a new kind of fertilizer. So when you boil it all down, the story of Tambora isn't really just about a volcano. It's about resilience. It shows us that catastrophes are incredibly complex. They are forces of immense destruction, for sure, but they can also be unpredictable engines of creation and progress all at the same time. Which leaves us with a final pretty big thought. The Tambora eruption was a natural climate disaster that totally reshaped the world. Today, we're facing our own accelerating climate crises. The story of 1816 really forces us to ask, beyond all the chaos and the loss, what unforeseen monsters and what unexpected inventions are being born right now in the middle of our own changing world?